All right, so let us open in prayer. Oh, Lord Heavenly Father, we are just so grateful to be here. We're so grateful to be together. Thank you so much for drawing all of us here. Thank you so much for Jeffrey for teaching this class. He is just a wealth of knowledge, and we just enjoy his teaching so much. And we pray that we are edified by his teaching, and that we are able to take that out into the cold, dark world and be a light to others. We pray a blessing on all of us here and all of the things that happen here between us. We just pray all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, again, nice to see you all, and very much looking forward to our course. This has always been one of our most popular Areopagus courses, but it's been 6 years since we offered it. And so I'm very excited about it. As Don also mentioned, we have C.S. Lewis tour coming up in late April, early May, and it's a course requirement if you're going to pass this course. So go ahead and schedule that, and plan to join us. But very much looking forward to that as well. Dolly, did you have any? You've got a couple more, or 2 or 3 more study guides. Does anyone need a study guide? And here's one. So I think you'll find there's a tremendous amount of content in this course. And so I would encourage you to take notes if you're drawn to do so. And hey, Aaron, welcome. And so now I wanted to start by just mentioning the announcement that we had originally sent out about this course. And in that, I mentioned that C.S. Lewis is certainly one of the most influential Christians of the 20th century. He was certainly a very prolific author. His writings have impacted Christians of all denominations. In a poll taken by Christianity Today in 2000, Lewis was voted the most popular Christian author of the century, and his book, Mere Christianity, was chosen the greatest Christian book of the last 100 years. I would agree. It's certainly my favorite of all his writings, and frankly, I think it's my favorite of any Christian book I can recall over the last century or so. Now, this course covers the major influences in Lewis's life, including his lonely and turbulent childhood and his military service in World War I, where he was injured or wounded pretty severely, his early career as an atheist scholar and professor, his conversion to Christianity, which is really remarkable. Some of you probably are quite familiar with the story. It's an amazing conversion experience. His major works in Christian apologetics, science fiction, children's literature, his involvement with J.R.R. Tolkien and others in a group called the Inklings. They would meet once a week at a pub in Oxford called the Eagle and Child, and they would spend 2 or 3 hours discussing their writings and what they were reading currently and so on. And you can still go to Oxford and visit the Eagle and Child today. And we'll be doing that in our tour, which you'll be coming on. So also his relationship with Joy Davidman Gresham, whom he later married. Lewis was no average Christian, but he was, to use his own terms, a mere Christian, a person whose life was devoted to the basic core beliefs and practices of the historic Christian faith. And in that respect, he serves as a model, I think, for us all, regardless of denominational background and so on. As John R.W. Stott once noted, C.S. Lewis, whose says C.S. Lewis was a Christ-centered, great tradition, mainstream Christian whose stature a generation after his death seems greater than anyone ever thought while he was alive, and whose Christian writings are now seen as having classic status. So I think very well put. And how many of you are pretty familiar with the life and career and the writings of C.S. Lewis? I mean, so about half or so, okay. And he is one of those that the deeper you go into his writings, the more you have to appreciate his brilliance, his insight, also his humility, for that matter, which is a rare commodity, for academics, intellectuals who are so inherently brilliant and yet, in his case, very humble and very open to others as well. So do you have any questions or comments, anything before we get into the material itself? Anything that, yes, you in the back there, yes.
I think we didn't give good enough directions, but I'm going to pass this around once more because if your name isn't on here and your email address, I need you to write it on. If we run out of space, just turn it over and do it on the back. But your name, if it's on here, if you'll check it off so that we know that we've got it on his computer.
Well, and we'll be sending out regular, announcements throughout the term of the course and all. So does any?
Start the first row and then
like where next week's class is going to be.
Yeah, yeah. Well, like I said, Donna, if you're really spirit led, you'll find it. So anyway, I know a lot of you do have the study guide, and so if you'd like to open that up and take a look at the contents here, and we'll spend a few minutes talking about a chronology of C.S. Lewis's life in just a few minutes. And then, of course, most of the study guide will delve into the life and works of C.S. Lewis. I included in this edition of the study guide an appendix with several just absolutely excellent articles that I think you'll enjoy reading as well. And then at the end is a recommended bibliography of some of the best works on his life. And the next page is it's 13 or 14 weeks. Yeah, 13 or 14. I can't remember exactly. On the next page, you see C.S. Lewis, a chronology. And so here's basically some of the highlights in his life and career. And here's a man born in 1898. He died in 1963, so he lived to be 65 years old. He died, by the way, does anybody know the date when C.S. Lewis died? I'm sorry. Yeah, November 22nd, 1963, the same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. There's also another very notable individual who died the same day. Anybody know who I'm? Well, yes, Kennedy, C.S. Lewis, and also
Aldous Huxley.
Yeah, Aldous Huxley. Thank
And
you.
then 10 years later, I was born.
And Aldous Huxley. Now, there's a great Christian philosopher and apologist by the name of Peter Kreeft. And years ago, Peter Kreeft wrote a book in which he highlighted C.S. Lewis, John F. Kennedy, and Aldous Huxley as representing the three basic worldviews. And it's a fascinating book. And so with C.S. Lewis, obviously, what you have is somebody who represents Orthodox historic Christianity. With Aldous Huxley, he died during a drug trip, basically. He was very much into Eastern mysticism or pantheism. And then John F. Kennedy, even though the Kennedy family were kind of nominal Catholics, I mean, he basically had a secular humanistic, worldview. And so those three representing three discernible, worldview. And so it's called Between Heaven and Hell, and it depicts Kennedy, Huxley, and C.S. Lewis as they have died and they're awaiting their final destination. They're kind of sitting in the waiting room, okay, for eternity. And while they're sitting there, they begin discussing their understanding or misunderstanding of the nature of God and truth in general. So if that sounds of interest, I'd encourage you reading that book, Between Heaven and Hell by Peter Kreeft. So there you see some of the highlights in that chronology of Lewis's life. Also in the right-hand column over there, some of his major publications. And if you turn the page there, you see some very, very well-known books, The Abolition of Man, The Great Divorce, the book he wrote on miracles, the first of his fantasy series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and also, of course, you see there Mere Christianity and Surprised by Joy, which is just a fantastic book to read. It's his autobiography, essentially, or at least his autobiography up to the point of his conversion. And if you haven't read that, I think you'd find it extremely interesting. And then another book that's oftentimes overlooked, but is just absolutely riveting, is his book that he wrote in 1960, 61, near the end of his life. It's called A Grief Observed. And here is somebody who had never had a love relationship with a woman in his life until very late in his life. And this woman we'll talk about, Joy Davidman, came into his life. They eventually, after maintaining a very close friendship for several years, they got married. And then very soon after that, she died. And he was just absolutely shattered and heartbroken. And so A Grief Observed is a very raw exposure when it comes to his feelings, and something that you wouldn't actually expect from somebody like C.S. Lewis. But it's certainly a book worth reading. As you know, one of the greatest challenges we always face in life is what theologians refer to as the theodicy issue. In other words, if God is truly great, if God is truly good, why is there so much suffering and pain and evil and all in this life? And oftentimes, affecting us very directly as well. And so A Grief Observed is an attempt to wrestle with those realities. Okay. All right. Now, as I go through the material, don't hesitate at all. Any comments or questions you might have that are relevant, obviously, to what we're talking about, but don't feel like you're interrupting. I welcome, that kind of interaction. So please don't hold back. Well, except certain ones of you. All right. Now on page 3 of the study guide begins the outline, The Life and Works of a Mere Christian, introduction. And so I'd like to go through that pretty rapidly, but again, any comments or questions, any expanded explanations, please don't hesitate. I always like to start off anything on C.S. Lewis with this quote. You've probably seen it before. It's from an article he wrote called "Is Theology Poetry?" And the quote is, quote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it, I see everything else. So the point there is that Christianity is a worldview. It's not just a religion. I mean, it is a religion, but it's, as we know, primarily, it's a spiritual relationship with God through faith in Jesus Christ and through the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit. So primarily, Christianity is a spiritual relationship. Now, it's also a religion, and Lewis here is implying that Christianity is also a worldview. It's a comprehensive worldview by which we see and understand and interpret everything that goes on in our lives and so on. Now, Lewis was a renowned lecturer and a tutor in medieval literature. That was his specialty, was really medieval and Renaissance literature at Oxford University for 30 years. In 1947, Time magazine, a very secular, publication, called C.S. Lewis, quote, the most popular lecturer in the university. Now, that was a concession that among his students, he was one of the very most popular professors, lecturers. Among his fellow faculty members, he wasn't popular at all because they were overwhelmingly secular. And they really resented and in some cases just despised him for his for his Christian convictions and expressions and so on. Now, for the last few years of his career, he was a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University. Since Oxford never promoted him to full professorship, eventually Cambridge came along and offered him a full professorship. So he left Oxford the last few years of his career and taught at Cambridge. He's generally recognized as one of the 20th century's most gifted, prolific writers. The man was obviously a first-rate scholar. He was a great Christian apologist, in other words, somebody who understands philosophy and theology and can not only explain, but also defend the beliefs of the Christian faith. That's apologia, to provide a rational defense of what you believe. And so he's a first-rate Christian apologist. He's a poet, not so gifted in that respect, but anyway, scientific sci-fi writer, an author of children's fantasy novels, and somebody who could write with great charm and great wit. He can be quite humorous at times, tremendous insight, and occasional eloquence as well. Now, he was always disinterested in impressing the literati, the intellectual elite. And he basically directs his writings to the common person, to the common man. And he does it in a very conversational first-person tone. So his priority is never impressing his peers, who are supposedly the intellectual elite. And yet he's a first-rate debater, and he can take on virtually anybody, philosophers, scientists, anybody, when it comes to debates. So he has very, very sharp mind. But his primary audience is the English people, and later, of course, Americans and others, and impressing upon them just how the Christian faith is not only a source of inspiration, it's also true, with a capital T. And in fact, as we know, that's the only reason to be a Christian, is not how it makes you feel or the nice people you meet at church and the nice accommodations sometimes they provide, but rather is the Christian faith in fact true, with a capital T. And he understands this and acknowledges and promotes that. Although he writes for the common person, he doesn't pander to his audience, and he writes with very incisive profundity. So sometimes when you're reading his works, sometimes you have to go back and read it second, third time, but it's just because these truths he's dealing with are again so profound. But he tries to write in a way not to impress the elite, but to convey the truth to common people. Mere Christianity is his informal primer in Christian apologetics. And as I mentioned earlier, it is arguably the most significant, influential Christian book of the 20th century. Up until about 7 or 8 years ago, when I last researched this, his books had sold over 250 million copies worldwide. And so I'm sure it's several million more than that now. Did any of you see the new Bob Dylan movie that came out? Yeah. Well, you know, for a brief period of time. Oh, who did, by the way? Let me take names. Who, you know, at a certain time in his life, actually the late 70s, Bob Dylan, for several years, claimed to be a Christian, that he had had a Christian conversion. And part of his conversion has to do with the fact that somebody in his traveling band at the time was reading Mere Christianity, and they were circulating the book among, you know, other people on the buses and in the band and all. And Dylan read Mere Christianity, and that was one factor that apparently, you know, propelled him toward accepting Christ. At least he professed to have accepted Christ. We certainly pray that that was the case. He's certainly one of the greatest Christian thinkers of the 20th century, although neither a professional. Now, here's somebody who's not a professional philosopher. He's not a professional theologian. He's not a professional Bible scholar. He's not a professional historian. He's not a professional psychologist or social scientist. But when he addresses all of those fields, he writes with, you know, just very, very perceptively. In fact, one of the best introductions to a critique of modern psychology would be the 2 chapters in Mere Christianity, where he addresses Freud, who was, of course, the guru of psychology back in those days, and his critique of Freud and modern psychology in general. So when he addresses issues like that, I mean, he's just really extraordinarily perceptive. A rarity among intellectuals, he reconciled and balanced reason and imagination. See, he understands that when taken to extremes, reason leads to rationalism. In other words, the idea that all we need to get by in this life is our own rational mind and so on. We don't need any outside help. So that, you know, we're all called to be rational people, but rationalism takes it, you know, to an extreme. So he understands that reason can lead to rationalism, and also imagination can lead to romanticism or escapism from reality. And so, as I said, a rarity among intellectuals, he understands that we need a balance in those areas. Yeah, we need to be rational people. We also have been gifted by God with a sense of imagination and creativity. And those are all just wonderful gifts of God. We need to use them to the utmost. But we also need to realize that we need a balance between those 2 perspectives. In time, he became one of the great Christian celebrities of the 20th century. As his reputation and popularity grew, he became a cult figure to many people, kind of a spiritual master who had the answers to life's questions. Okay. And he was rather uneasy with that, of course. But on the other hand, he's called by God to convey the truth that he understands, and he does it very effectively and so on. Now, in 1993, there was a Hollywood movie that came out called Shadowlands. And this is a movie that focused on his love life late in life, his romanticized love relationship with Joy Davidman Gresham. And the movie, by the way, starred Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger. And so that came out in 1993. In the year 2000, Christianity Today voted Mere Christianity the most influential book of the 20th century, Christian book. Number 2, any idea what number 2 on their list would have been?
Well, it says it right there.
Oh, Oh, well, you read very well. Yeah, okay. So that- yeah, well, the answer is Screwtape Letters. Now, in the year 2002, one of the most popular courses at Harvard was called Sigmund Freud and C.S. Lewis, Two Contrasting Worldviews. Now, this is, you can get the DVDs, or I guess these days you can view it online. And it's just really brilliant. This course at Harvard was taught by a professor in the Harvard Medical School named Dr. Armin Nikolai. And it compares and contrasts the worldview and the belief system of C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud. And again, just wonderful insight into the vast dramatic difference in these two worldviews. I'm sorry. Oh, did Lewis and Freud ever meet? No. I don't believe, no, I don't think that's true. No, I'm almost certain they never actually met. They were contemporaries, though, as you know. And then in 2004, that course, that Harvard course, became the basis for a PBS documentary called The Question of God. And again, it's about, I don't know, 8 or 10 hours and just really thought-provoking. I'd certainly recommend it. In terms of his character and personality, Lewis was certainly an interesting study in contrasts. The man has obviously a first-rate mind. He's very astute. He's very engaging in terms of being a conversationalist. But as a teacher and a tutor, he had a reputation of being very kind, very courteous, very generous, and very intellectually stimulating, especially to his students who were diligent, serious students. Now, on the other hand, for arrogant students and lazy students, he could be very direct, very demanding, and very confrontational, as a good professor should be, by the way. He was not particularly popular with his Oxford colleagues, due mostly to their anti-Christian bias and their professional jealousy regarding his influence. In debates, especially with proud skeptics, he could be absolutely tenacious. He could be argumentative and even bullying. As one biographer, A.N. Wilson, put it, his jolly red face was that of an intellectual bruiser. Okay. So he didn't tolerate lies, okay, and distortions, and especially from people who should have known better, you know, faculty and elite universities and so on. Now, he's also a heavy drinker and a chain smoker. And we're told that he could smoke a couple of packs a day between pipes. So here's somebody who apparently doesn't do or think much at all in moderation. Okay, so not an example, by the way, in that regard. I mean, not a positive example. One of his biographers, A.N. Wilson, says Lewis was impatient with Puritanism and he disliked teetotalers. In Mere Christianity, in fact, he calls Islam the teetotalers' religion. And I've always thought that in truth, he must often have smelled like a beer-soaked ashtray. If you've ever been around those, I hope you haven't. Okay.
Gonna be a fun trip.
Well, we're not going to necessarily emulate his lifestyle on our trip. Yeah, no. No. Yes, Bruce.
Yeah, just a little color commentary. Our view of education, higher education, is so much around lectures, we go to class. So maybe you have office hours with the professor once a week if you're lucky. If you're lucky. But in Oxford and Cambridge, at least certainly at that time, still to this day, you didn't have lectures, but you spent time with, you would give assign a tutor. Like if you were in anthropology or Greek literature, you'd have a tutor with Greek literature. And you would go to meet with him in his chambers. and talk with him either by yourself or with other people who are also being tutored by him.
Mhm.
And the subject of these conversations was almost always a paper that you had submitted, that you had written, and it would be taken apart completely.
Mhm.
Not only by the tutor, but also potentially by the students as well. So as Jeffrey said, it could be very uplifting or it could be very demeaning and embarrassing if you did a bad job. But people through that process said they learned so much from that as opposed to sitting there in the fifth row in the back balcony taking notes from somebody in the class.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's why
So
you never
he-
knew how long it was gonna take you to get a degree in Oxford, because you worked until your professor thought you had enough done that you might have a paper, they either accept you or not.
Mhm. Yeah, quite different from the American system. Yeah.
Or the German.
Yeah, or the German system as well. So for good reasons, the theologian Alistair McGrath subtitled his biography of C.S. Lewis, quote, "Eccentric Genius and Reluctant Prophet." And I'd say that, you know, as a result, therefore, his mentality and his life experiences are fertile ground for psychobiographers. Now, when it comes to psychobiography, you know, that's a field that needs to be, oh, thank you, needs to be approached with caution, because psychobiographies can be very insightful, but on the other hand, they can just totally distort, you know, our understanding of an individual. Now, Lewis's papers and memorabilia are housed in two archival collections that have very contrasting views of the man. If you were to go to Wheaton College outside of Chicago, you could go to the Wade Center, and you could, this was a center that was established by a man named Clyde Kilby. It's currently being administered by a man named Lyle Dorset. And if you were to visit that center, your impression would be that C.S. Lewis was a great conservative theologian and a bulwark against all the insidious influences of theological liberalism. And this certainly is true to an extent. He was an ardent defender of traditional Christian orthodoxy. But many aspects of his personality and lifestyle, of course, offer quite a contrast to the other great icon that we associate with Wheaton College, who would have been who? Billy Graham. Okay. So in terms of lifestyle and some of their practices, quite a contrast here, Billy Graham and C.S. Lewis, but God uses both of them in a tremendous way. Were you mentioning that you had visited the Wade Center in the past? Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
That was just completely secular.
Mhm. Wheaton College still has a good reputation generally among evangelicals. So that's one of the archival centers. Now, if you're in England, you could go to an archival collection that's housed at Oxford University, and it's directed by a man named Walter Hooper. And Walter Hooper became the co-executor of Lewis's literary estate after Lewis died, and he edited a lot of Lewis's posthumous works, a lot of works that hadn't gotten published yet. Walter Hooper took them and, you know, kind of cleaned them up and published them. Now, Walter Hooper also presided over weekly meetings of the C.S. Lewis Society there in Oxford. But Walter Hooper is a very controversial character. He exaggerated his relationship with C.S. Lewis. I won't go into the details, but anyway, he claims that he was, you know, a lot more involved in Lewis's thinking and life than is true. In fact, Lewis's brother, Warren, or who we know as Warnie Lewis, regarded Walter Hooper as basically just an opportunist who tried to profiteer off C.S. Lewis's life and accomplishments. Hooper was also an Anglican priest at the time of Lewis's death, but he later converted to Roman Catholicism. And so Walter Hooper, if you read some of his commentaries on C.S. Lewis, it infers that Lewis, had he lived longer, would surely have converted to the Catholic faith. But most people who knew Lewis said absolutely not, that's just Walter Hooper trying to impose his own, values, beliefs on C.S. Lewis. But anyway, Hooper regards Lewis as a virtual saint, and he's propagated the myth of what some biographers call the perpetual virginity of C.S. Lewis, despite the evidence, the overwhelming evidence that, very much to the contrary, okay? So Walter Hooper, not a particularly reliable source on Lewis. Now, again, Lewis is best known to us as a mere Christian, basic Christian. And what would account for his popularity that he's sustained ever since his death, 60 years ago or so? There's a great scholar at the University at Houston Baptist University named Louis Markos. Louis Markos is great when it comes to philosophy and what he's written on C.S. Lewis and so on. And Louis Markos writes, "It's no exaggeration to say that every modern Christian apologist has been influenced in some way or another by C.S. Lewis." And I think that's probably correct. Although no average man in some respects, Lewis serves as the everyman of the 20th century. And what I mean by that is, and I think I have this put on the second page there of the study guide, the everyman of the modern age. What do we mean by that? Well, Lewis grew up in a nominally Christian home. I mean, it was a very, quote, religious home, but there doesn't seem to have been a whole lot of true spiritual content in his home life. So he grows up as a nominal Christian, and as is the case in many people's lives who grow up, under those circumstances, by the time he was about 14 or 15 years old, he was declaring himself to be a very proud atheist, okay? In other words, by the time he was 14 or 15, he was so smart and had learned so much that he had figured out that Christianity, like all the other religions, is just a farce, okay? So he's a proud atheistic skeptic. But then the more he thinks about it and reads, the more he realizes what a dead end, literally, atheistic skepticism is. And so he becomes a romantic idealist. He would like to imagine that there is actually something worth living for and enjoying in life, and that life is not just a horrible, bleak existence, and then you rot in a grave for for centuries after that. So he becomes a romantic idealism. Now, that led him then into the occult. And we would, of course, and by the way, that was one of the steps toward his eventual conversion to Christianity. Now, we'd never recommend it, would we? We'd never tell anybody, well, first you need to get really involved in the occult. And, but in his case, see what happened with the occult, it opened him up to the realization that there is a spirit world, a spiritual dimension to life, at least an evil spiritual dimension. What's that? Yeah. He apparently did attend some seances. And so it's taking him out of atheism, though, into the perception that there must be something else. Okay. So he becomes an occultist. And after a short time in the occult, he realizes that it is so dark and frankly just absolutely evil. And so he believes, okay, well, I don't want to devote myself to that, but I do want to just be kind of a generic pantheist. He comes to the conclusion, like a lot of Hindus or Buddhists would, and that is that there is some kind of spiritual reality in life. In fact, the spiritual world is the only true world. This world, everything physical and material, is just an illusion, you know. In Hinduism, they call it Maya, okay? And so for a while, that's his chosen spirituality. Now, you might notice, though, that every Hindu or Buddhist or whatever who believes that this world is meaningless, the only thing that matters is our soul, our spirit, and materiality doesn't mean anything. But notice that every one of those people, when they come to the corner of a busy street, they look both ways before they cross, which wouldn't make any sense at all if we're not experiencing reality in the flesh. So it's a worldview and a religion that frankly doesn't hold up to the realities of life. So he becomes a pantheist, and yet he comes to the realization that even though the material world doesn't matter, and that all that really matters is spirit, he begins to wonder, well, why are there so many evil forces and also good? I mean, humanity has a tremendous capacity for goodness and decency and love and even self-sacrificial, behavior and everything. And yet humanity can be so absolutely despicable. And so he adopts an early pseudo-Christian heresy from the 2nd, 3rd century, and that's called Manichaeism. And Manichaeism would hold that there are two equal and opposite forces that control the universe. One's good and one's evil. And you can more or less choose which one to follow, but you're going to do it, not consistently or anything like that. So that's Manichaeism. There is one religion that was founded primarily on the basis of Manichaeism, and that's Zoroastrianism, which used to be the state religion in Persia, before Persia was conquered by Muslims later. So he becomes a Manichaeist because you've got to come up with some kind of reasonable explanation for all the hate and evil in the world, as well as all the good and love that exists as well. Eventually, he comes to the realization that Manichaeism, the idea that there's two equal and opposite power sources in the world, just really does not make sense, and that there has to be an ultimate source of goodness. And so he transitions then in his 20s to becoming a theist. But he's not a Christian yet. He believes that, various religions, I mean, even Islam and all, I mean, that's a theistic religion of sorts. And, but for several years, he will be a self-described theist. He believes there is a God, and he believes this is a God who has communicated innately to mankind that certain things are right and wrong, certain things are good and evil, regardless of our preferences. And so we call that understanding natural law, natural moral law. And where does that come from? Well, it can only come from an eternal, source, creative source, an omnipotent source that is the manifestation of goodness. And then eventually he'll have a conversion to the Christian faith, and we'll talk more about that in detail later, but it's a rather remarkable progression. So when you look at these various stages, and it's not like he's trying to check off a bunch of boxes as he goes through his early life, but he touches on virtually every orientation you can imagine in the modern world. A nominal Christian who becomes a skeptic and eventually a very proud atheist, but realizing what a dead end that is. So romantic idealism, that's sort of the basis, when you think about it, of secular existentialism. And that is, this world is just full of rot and awful stuff. But if we live with only that mindset, we can't wait to die, frankly. So we'd like to imagine that there's something worthwhile, good and decent and loving and so on and that's romantic idealism. Then theosophical occultism, pantheism, Manichaeism, theism, and eventually Christian theism. Any comments or questions you might? Yes.
What's the time frame for it? Is this like within a couple of years?
No, this will go from about age 13, 14 or so, when he starts questioning his nominal Christianity. And he'll finally experience a Christian conversion. Let's see, I think he's 32 at the time. Okay. So some of these phases last, a couple of years, or in some cases, probably not more than a few months. Yeah.
Jeffrey,
Yes, Jay.
Jay, I have one question. I heard about mere Christianity in the early 1970s when about 5 years I came to this country, but I thought the mere Christianity is kind of strange word. Mere Christianity has been translated back into Korea, and Korean the title, if I retranslate back to English, is pure Christianity. That's how they translated it. Do you have some idea why he named the book Mere Christianity? It's more
Well,
than basic Christianity.
that would have made, I think that would have been quite clear to English people in that day. Now, Americans would probably say, well, a better name for it would be basic Christianity.
Okay.
Or you say in Korea it would be what?
Pure Christianity.
Pure Christianity.
In Korean,
Yeah.
if I translate back to English, is pure Christianity.
Okay. Well, I think in Lewis's mind, again, the English, keep in mind, they can hardly speak English anyway. And so they're not always real clear
I see.
in their expressions, but they're trying to make the case, and Lewis was trying to make the case that this is not, that true Christianity is a spiritual relationship with God. Secondarily, it's also religion. But when you get into the realm of religion, you have everything from Roman Catholic to Anglican to on the other extreme, the Anabaptist, Mennonite, Amish, forms of Christianity. So Lewis wasn't interested in trying to explain and defend any particular view on Christianity. He's just interested in pure, as you said, pure Christianity or basic Christianity, rather than getting bogged down in denominational disputes.
So mere is more British terminology rather than American English terminology at that time?
Well, I think the way he uses it, yeah, it would be more self-explanatory for the British than it might be for Americans.
Okay.
Good question. Yes, Bruce?
Take another term that might be appropriate. That's essential Christianity.
Oh, essential. Okay, essential Christianity.
Essential. Okay, that's a good. Okay, essential.
It tells us that the Christian story is marvelously simple.
Mhm.
It's really not very complicated.
Mhm.
But you can look at Hindu mythology, Buddhism, so with their full bodhisattvas and all sorts of gods and everything. There's 15 different versions of Buddhism and so forth. And even in the West, in Catholic, from my way of thinking, not for anybody in there, but there is this whole pantheon of saints and so forth and so on. My children were amazed. We went to a cathedral in France and saw candles lit of Mary and all these other people, as if they were, so it can get it comfort and I think. He was getting it down to the core issue.
Yes, and denominationalism can really redirect our attention from again what matters most onto secondary and sometimes even superfluous issues. Okay. Which is not to say that secondary and superfluous issues are not important, but they're certainly not most important. So he's interested in what's most important. Yes.
But I've always thought, and I never thought about it, so the guy on the computer, it's a good question. But I think that there's a humility to it. mere Christianity, and I looked up the word mere, it said that is solely or no more or better than what is specified. Like the
Whoa.
simplicity of it. It's mere
Very good.
Christianity.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. So what is the Bible explicit about? And that's basic, mere, essential Christianity. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Anything else? Any other thoughts? All right. Oh, yes.
About the manichaeism, you were talking about how even these people that might say like, oh, the whole physical world is still check both ways, put across the street. I think that's a relatively modern issue. People just not taking their own beliefs seriously. Because you look historically back when Augustine was an MP, for example,
Yeah.
they were extremely penitential.
Yes.
And you see this again, especially 13th century, the Catholic heresy in France.
Yeah.
They were known for blacks.
Yeah.
Because they thought they were souls trapped in the body. And the way to get salvation was to escape your body.
Yeah. These are the Albigenses or Cathars.
Yeah, so it's like historically, we do see people that hold this worldview and actually like, they go to the line.
Yeah. 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 Certainly, there's nothing in the New Testament that would promote that, is there? Yeah. No, I knew you weren't. Yeah, I knew you weren't.
Like,
But
this
there,
issue of them, people saying things and not like following to this conclusion, that seems to be a relatively modern thing. Like historically, we see people like actually do this.
yeah, and at their best or their most pure, these are people who realize how unworthy of God's grace they are. And so they go to what seemingly is unbelievable extremes to try and purify their mind and body and behavior and so on, so as to, again, I don't want to question their motives, but as to earn God's favor, basically. Yeah. Yeah, like the flagellants, those who went through life whipping themselves just as a constant reminder of how sinful they are and unworthy of God's grace and so on. So thank God that's not it's not what the New Testament calls for. All right, now as a Christian writing in a post-Christian age, and we hear that term all the time in America, especially over the last several decades. Obviously, Europe became more secularized than America did. We were a few decades behind in that regard. But as a Christian writing in a post-Christian age, Lewis offered a scathing critique of secular humanistic modernism. Like J.R.R. Tolkien, Lewis's writings were self-consciously and deliberately at variance with 20th century trends and fads. Let me repeat that because that is so important and so contrary to how a lot of Christians think and act these days. And that's been the case for generations, actually. But like J.R.R. Tolkien, Lewis's writings were self-consciously and deliberately at variance with 20th century trends and fads. Boy, we could cogitate on that for a long time. Cogitate, ruminate, and meditate on that for a long time. Time magazine put it this way in their article in 1947 on C.S. Lewis. They said, Lewis is scornful of many modern intellectual and moral fashions. He's one of a growing band of heretics among modern intellectuals. He was considered a heretic by modern intellectuals who he believes in God and accepts all the articles of the Christian faith. And so for the intellectual elite, I mean, he's really behind the times, okay? Because we're evolving, keep in mind, see, and we're evolving to higher levels of consciousness and so on. From generation to generation, supposedly. And Lewis, I mean, he's like living in the, past, before World War I and before, truly the modern age emerged. But paradoxically, because his writings address the perennial issues of life, those issues that every individual has to take seriously and deal with seriously in terms of what's the purpose of my life? Why am I even here? Why did God create me? What's my role in life? These issues that Lewis deals with are timeless and always relevant. So he's not trying to keep up with the fads of the day. And I wish we had better examples of that in many of our churches, by the way. As a logical apologist who came to faith through the influence of imaginative myth, C.S. Lewis appeals to rationalists and mystics alike. Lewis was a, quote, mere Christian, a great tradition Christian, as he called it, a great tradition Christian. And as such, he appeals to believers across the theological and denominational spectrum. What mattered to Lewis were the core defining doctrines of the Christian faith, the core defining doctrines. The incarnation of Christ, that matters. The atonement of Christ, the resurrection, the physical bodily resurrection, and the doctrine of the Trinity, and so on. I mean, those are things that matter the most. And in that regard, he will not waver or compromise. Louis Marcos, again, great scholar at Houston Baptist University, said that Lewis was boldly orthodox, but generously ecumenical. So he understands what's absolutely essential and what's secondary. And if he disagrees with people on secondary or even superfluous issues, well, he can love them as a Christian should. His adopted son, Douglas Gresham, puts it this way: members of several churches proclaim that C.S. Lewis was one of us. In fact, though, he was a Christian not given to isms. And while he preferred to attend the local Anglican church, this was more a matter of convenience than of conviction. So he would not have necessarily said, yeah, I'm into Anglicanism, or I'm into Catholicism, or I'm into Presbyterianism or Lutheranism or Baptistism, whatever the word would be, okay? So throughout his life, he remains convinced that sectarianism is one of the devil's most effective weapons against Christianity. Just think about it. Now, when I taught at Georgia State for many years, and I truly wish that I had known one of our English professors. His name was Dabney Hart. And Dabney Hart wrote in one of his articles on C.S. Lewis, Lewis satisfies our desire for certainty. He was an absolutely orthodox and at the same time intellectually rigorous. He was an Anglican, but he appeals to Catholics and Protestants alike. So again, I didn't know that Dabney, in a big university like that, you don't have much interaction with people in other departments. But I wish I'd known Dabney Hart when I was at Georgia State. A.N. Wilson says, Lewis's attempts to justify an old-fashioned Christian orthodoxy have made him an internationally celebrated and reassuring figure to those believers who have felt betrayed by the compromises of mainline Christian churches. Goes on to say, to the amazement, you all have a good evening. Okay. I told Paul and Donna they needed to leave early, and I said, oh, fine, just don't walk out shaking your head and mumbling under your breath, and so they must have been taking notes. No, they're wonderful. So Wilson says that Lewis's attempts to justify an old-fashioned Christian orthodoxy have made him an internationally celebrated and reassuring figure to those believers who have felt betrayed by the compromises of mainline Christian churches. To the amazement of those who knew him in his lifetime, he's become something very much like a saint in the minds of conservative-minded believers. Now, again, this idea that, Lewis was not into denominationalism, but he went to the local Anglican church. And you can go to Oxford, as we will on our tour, as all of us will go. And you can go to his church, and they'll show you where C.S. Lewis sat in the congregation. Well, he sat behind a big, thick pillar, because when the pastor's sermon, apparently the pastor was not real eloquent, a very accomplished preacher. And so Lewis could doze off and without being noticed from the pulpit and from the pastor. So anyway, though, to secularists, C.S. Lewis was, and he still is, a very despised individual. One old Oxford Don, one of the senior members of the faculty, told a Lewis scholar, quote, "Lewis was the most evil man I've ever met." On further inquiry, though, it turned out that the man was offended by Lewis's Christian faith. He complained that Lewis, quote, "used his cleverness to corrupt the young." He used his cleverness to corrupt the young. Now, does that remind you of any other famous person in history who was accused of the same thing? Well, that's what Socrates was accused of, corrupting the youth. And so rather than allow the state to execute him, Socrates just drank poison, and committed suicide. But Lewis used his cleverness to corrupt the young. Now, when A.N. Wilson's psychobiography on Lewis came out in 1990, it sparked a series of venomous reviews of Lewis's life and work. A.N. Wilson was lauded for opening the door to Lewis's inner world and exposing his questionable relationship with a much older woman earlier in his life. And one C.S. Lewis scholar, Christopher Derrick, describes the pathological hatred of Lewis by secular skeptics, including many of his colleagues, who call him, "What a disgusting individual. He's an outmoded thinker. He's also a dogmatist." Not that they were dogmatists. Now, to make matters worse, they also wrote how he wore shabby clothes. You'd never want to trust somebody like that. He also drank a lot of beer, and he was, I like this one. He was also far from slender. Okay. And Christopher Derrick says, "I psychoanalyze the hostility in terms of Lewis still being perceived as a threat, a most formidable challenge to the various comfortable habits of the secular humanist mind." So C.S. Lewis is a threat to the trends of the day and the intellectual elite who think they're so far above everyone else. But as a mere Christian, he serves as an example for us all. As Clement of Alexandria taught, this would have been around the year 200, every serious Christian should aspire to be what? Well, a Bible scholar, a theologian, one who thinks deeply about God, the nature and character of God, a philosopher, one who takes life seriously and why are we here and what should we be doing in this life, a Christian apologist, someone who understands the Christian faith and can explain it effectively to others, but also defend the Christian faith from all these attacks that come our way. Also a contemplative mystic. Also a very astute social observer and a social critic. And we'll talk about, in a few weeks, we'll talk about one area of Lewis's life and career that is oftentimes just absolutely ignored by a lot of scholars, including many of his biographers, and that's his views on politics and his political theory, basically. He wrote quite a lot about that, and I wrote a short book on that just 3 or 4 years ago. C.S. Lewis on politics, uh, uh, on government politics and the good society, basically. Closing here, Walter Hooper, who again served briefly as Lewis's private secretary and later as the co-executor of his estate, wrote in tribute, quote, "Lewis struck me as the most thoroughly converted man I've ever met." Wow, isn't that amazing? Regardless of the quality of the home in which you were raised and how you came to faith in Jesus Christ and all, I think even those of us who might have been raised in just the most admirable homes and families imaginable, we realize that that's insufficient, that our conversion continues on perpetually through life. So Walter Hooper says, he struck me as the most thoroughly converted man I ever met. Christianity for him was never a separate compartment of life. It's not like he had a secular life and a religious life. His whole vision of life was such that the natural and the supernatural seemed inseparably combined. And so I think when you look at Lewis and his great contribution to Christianity in the 20th century, and now we're well into the 21st, it's hard to come up with anybody who maybe was a greater sage, a greater thinker, and exemplifier of the Christian life than C.S. Lewis. What are some names that would come to mind for you? Who would you look back at, or even perhaps people living today, and you'd say, wow, that individual really is such a model of Christian thinking and living and influence? Who would come to mind? Billy Graham, one of the greatest evangelists in all of Christian history.
I've enjoyed listening to John Lennox lately, and he
Oh,
tells a story of
yeah.
that.
Yeah, yeah, John is wonderful. And one of our great thinkers today, John Lennox. Who else comes to mind? Pardon me?
Southern Church.
Oh,
The
Is-
seven, God wrote the seven.
purpose-driven life. Yeah. That I think that was the biggest selling book in was it 90s or the early 2000s or something?
He hasn't worked for money at his church.
Yeah, that's right. He was making so much money off his book sales that he stopped taking a salary from the church. I mean, how many pastors can you imagine?
He hasn't taken a salary in about 15 years.
Mhm,
I think
mhm.
he also said he gives 90% of the world.
Okay. Yeah, it's yeah, quite admirable. Who else would you consider to be a great role model? Okay, John. Oh yeah, John Piper. Any other names that come to mind? Yes.
Chuck Colson, big one. Chuck Colson.
Oh, Chuck Colson.
Kind of a
Mhm.
intellectual late in life.
Yes. Yeah, pretty phenomenal conversion, wasn't it? I would say along with some of the people you've mentioned, Francis Schaeffer. Great Christian thinker. And especially when it came to cultural issues and some of the cultural trends that we need to be very aware of and very cautious about as well. Anyone else? Okay, Alistair Begg. Yeah. Charles Spurgeon. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe to a degree.
Going back to the 19th century. Yeah. Mhm.
Maybe to a degree, Brendan Manning. Ragamuffin Gospels, grace.
Yeah, I just vaguely remember that. Yeah. So, pardon me? Oh, D.L. Moody going back to the 19th century as well. Yeah. Mhm. So we have a lot of excellent examples, and I think we all realize that and you realize this more and more, the older you get, we all have a very limited amount of time. We have a very limited amount of energy. We have a very limited amount of resources. So when you think about time, energy, and resources, it makes it absolutely imperative. It's all about priorities, isn't it? And so we need to constantly be reevaluating, reassessing our priorities and how we spend our time and our energy and our resources. And I think maybe my first question when I get to heaven is going to be, why did I have to sleep a third of my life? I mean, I could have accomplished a whole lot more. But anyway.
In that same vein, I think it's important because hearing this wonderful life of this man and all that he was filtered into his life from every direction, holds some different things.
Mhm.
And I think he just got to the point that he just kept asking himself, what matters for eternity?
Mhm.
I mean, simplicity, and that's what I live my life on. The only Jesus will matter.
Yeah, people who don't even believe in God or don't believe that life has any meaning and purpose, they live their lives as if it had meaning and purpose. Yeah. And sometimes they come to that awareness and realize, well, my philosophy of life is really corrupting. Why is it that it's a part of human nature that we want to think and believe or imagine that our lives have transcendent meaning? Where's that idea come from? Just like, where's the idea of beauty come from? I mean, all this stuff is just atoms, right? Arrangements of atoms. And why do we recognize that some things in nature and so on are just beautiful? And I mean, it's just material stuff, right? Yeah. So, well, it's great being with you this evening. Yes, Bruce, a comment, and then we'll.
I think it's not something, it depends on the perspective. You take a twig off a tree. You could look at it, take it, study it, and you could get a PhD in what's going on in that twig. Things are absolutely incomprehensible. Sometimes the big level something was ugly, but people do great photographs doing ugly things that really look good. That's when you're pointing, I think everything. Not amazed at the natural world, I don't know what's wrong.
Yeah. And there's only two answers for why all this stuff exists, including us. And that is, we are, the universe has always existed. And without any divine mind or intelligent design, it's arranged itself in such a way as to function along the lines of natural physical laws. And pardon me? Yeah, that's presumption, isn't it? That's well beyond rational faith. So that's one explanation. And the other one is that there is a omnipotent, eternal creator God who is the divine mind behind everything that exists. And those are our only two options, frankly. And the first one makes no sense whatsoever, that we're just flukes of the universe with no purpose in life whatsoever. And what accounts for the universe and the natural physical laws that govern the universe and all? Well, we're just lucky. That's all. That's what they'll say, is we're just lucky, just like of all the billions and billions of stars and I don't know how many planets, we're just lucky that we wound up on this one. Okay. And so that takes a leap of faith that's beyond reason, frankly. Well, let's close things out. Looking or turning to those of you online, any comments before we close out our session this evening?
I had just one question. Mere Christianity started as a broadcast during the World War II. Did he take any position against Hitler or Nazi as Bonhoeffer did?
Oh, yeah, Lewis was very explicitly anti-Nazi, anti-communist. And by the way, at Oxford and Cambridge and all these elite universities, you had a lot of faculty members who, by the time World War II started, they were anti-Nazi. But many of them were very sympathetic toward communism. And so one thing that set Lewis apart from a lot of his colleagues and generated a lot of anger and animosity was he saw communism and Nazism as equal and opposite evils. And that was, believe it or not, that was rare for back then. Yeah. All right, well, wonderful being with you all. And by the way, those of you online, in just a few days, and Andrea can give us more specific directions, you can order the C.S. Lewis study guide, The Life and Works of a Mere Christian. And Andrea, I guess we can send out more information on that. And but this will help you a lot, I think, keep up with what we're talking about and taking notes and so on. Andrea, you have any thoughts on that, or you want to?
I'm sorry, I was trying to find the window that I'm in.
Well, this will be available in a few days online, correct?
It already is.
It already is.
It already
Okay,
is,
great.
yep. Yes.
Okay, so I would really encourage you to order it. And I think you'll get so much more out of the course as a result. Thank you. Good being with you all. Blessings on your
Thank you.
evening and rest of the week.
Thank you.